Embarrassed by his wife, he hatched a cruel plan with his ex to get rid of her. But karma had its own surprise waiting for him. What goes around always comes back around. The grand dining hall of the Blackwood estate glimmered under the soft glow of a crystal chandelier. Catherine Blackwood moved with grace, her floral apron tied neatly over a modest dress. She placed a steaming roast on the mahogany table, her delicate hands trembling slightly. Her husband, Richard, leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone with a disinterested expression. He glanced up momentarily, giving her a forced smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Richard had built a reputation for being the perfect gentleman. To the outside world, he was the charismatic CEO of a booming tech company, and Catherine, his loving wife, supported him quietly. What the world didn't see was his growing disdain for her. Catherine, a small-town woman with a heart of gold, didn't fit the image of the sleek, sophisticated partner Richard had envisioned when his company started gaining traction. She wasn't glamorous like the other CEOs' wives. Her presence in social gatherings embarrassed him, though he never voiced it directly. "Dinner's ready," she said softly, setting the final dish. Her eyes lingered on Richard, hoping for a word of praise. Richard barely acknowledged her. "You're late," he muttered, his tone sharp. Catherine bit her lip but said nothing. Richard's coldness had grown unbearable over the past few months, yet she clung to hope, believing this was a phase they would overcome. What Catherine didn't know was that Richard had begun crafting a plan, one he had already shared with his ex-girlfriend, the cunning and conniving Victoria Hayes. Victoria had returned into Richard's life under the guise of professional collaboration, but their old spark reignited quickly. Unlike Catherine, Victoria exuded the elegance and charm Richard craved. Over dinner meetings and secret rendezvous, the two began plotting how to remove Catherine from the equation, permanently. In the dimly lit lounge of an exclusive city club, Richard swirled his glass of whiskey. Across from him sat Victoria Hayes, her sharp features illuminated by the amber glow of the room. She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers resting on the edge of her glass, a sly smile playing on her lips. "She's holding you back," Victoria said, her voice smooth and dripping with venom. "You can't keep dragging her to these events, Richard. People are starting to notice." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know. Every time I walk into a room with Catherine, I feel invisible. She doesn't fit into this world. And she never will," Victoria added pointedly. "But I do." Victoria's confidence was intoxicating. She was everything Richard believed Catherine was not: polished, ambitious, and ruthless. It wasn't long before their conversations shifted from professional matters to personal grievances, and then to the ultimate betrayal. "We have to be smart about this," Richard said, lowering his voice. "Catherine isn't stupid. She's kind and trusting, but she knows when something's wrong." Victoria smirked. "Leave the details to me. You just focus on keeping up appearances until we're ready." As they leaned closer, their conversation laced with schemes and deception, a waiter approached to refill their glasses. Richard stiffened, his paranoia momentarily surfacing. Victoria, however, remained calm and composed, brushing his hand with hers. "Relax, darling," she said with a playful chuckle. "No one's watching." But someone was. At a corner table, hidden in the shadows, a young journalist named Evelyn Moore observed them intently. She wasn't there by coincidence. Evelyn had been following Victoria for weeks, suspecting her of being involved in shady dealings. Now, she had stumbled onto something even bigger. As Richard and Victoria continued their hushed plotting, Evelyn discreetly snapped a photo with her phone. She didn't know the full story yet, but her instincts told her she had just uncovered a scandal that could shake the Blackwood name to its core. Back at the table, Richard finally stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "This has to be perfect," he said, his voice laced with desperation. "It will be," Victoria replied confidently. "Catherine will never see it coming." Richard left the club feeling a mix of guilt and exhilaration, unaware that his forbidden alliance had already set the wheels of karma in motion. Catherine sat at the large oak dining table, tracing the delicate patterns etched into its surface with her fingertips. Dinner had long grown cold, and the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. Richard was late again. She glanced at the clock and sighed. Over the past months, Richard's absences had become more frequent. Work meetings, late-night calls, and out-of-town conferences had started to dominate his life, or at least that's what he told her. Catherine wanted to believe him, but the nagging feeling in her gut wouldn't let her rest. When the sound of the front door finally broke the silence, she straightened in her chair. Richard walked in, his tie slightly loosened and his expression unreadable. He barely glanced her way as he set down his briefcase and poured himself a drink from the bar. "You're late," Catherine said softly, trying to mask the concern in her voice. "Busy day," he replied curtly, avoiding her gaze. "I didn't have time to call." Catherine stood and walked toward him. "I understand, but we need to talk. You've been distant lately, Richard. I feel like I'm losing you." Richard stiffened, his grip tightening on the glass. "You're imagining things, Catherine. I'm just stressed. The company's expansion is taking everything I've got." "Then let me help," she said earnestly. "You don't have to carry it all alone. We're a team, aren't we?" Her words hit a nerve. The very idea of Catherine inserting herself into his world, the one he wanted to keep her far away from, filled him with irritation. He forced a smile, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Of course we're a team," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I just need some space right now. Trust me, okay?" Catherine nodded reluctantly, but her heart felt heavier than before. She wanted to trust him, but the growing distance between them was undeniable. As Richard disappeared into his study, shutting the door behind him, Catherine stood alone in the dimly lit room. In the days that followed, the cracks in their relationship only deepened. Richard would often stay out late, and when he was home, he avoided meaningful conversation. Catherine, determined to salvage their marriage, began planning small gestures to remind him of the love they once shared. One evening, she surprised him with a candlelit dinner, recreating the meal they had shared on their first anniversary. She spent hours preparing the dishes, carefully setting the table with their finest china. But when Richard arrived home, he barely glanced at the effort she had put in. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone more curious than appreciative. "It's for us," Catherine said, forcing a smile. "I thought we could spend some time together, just the two of us." Richard hesitated, glancing at his phone as it buzzed in his pocket. "That's thoughtful, but I have to take care of something tonight. Rain check?" Before she could respond, he was already walking away, his phone pressed to his ear. Catherine stood by the table, the warmth of the candles doing little to ease the chill that had settled over her heart. In his study, Richard dialed Victoria. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered. "She's starting to notice." Victoria's voice was calm, almost amused. "Let her notice. It won't matter soon." As Catherine cleared the untouched plates, she couldn't shake the feeling that her world was slowly unraveling. But what she didn't know was that Richard's world was already on the verge of collapse, and the consequences of his choices would soon catch up to him in ways he could never anticipate. In a dimly lit corner of an upscale cafe, Richard sat across from Victoria, his ex-girlfriend turned mistress. The table between them held 2 untouched cups of coffee, but neither of them was interested in small talk. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "We can't keep doing this in the shadows," he said, his jaw clenched. "I can't keep living this double life." Victoria tilted her head, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Then stop," she said simply. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you? You've wanted out of this marriage for months." Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that simple. Catherine's not just going to sign the divorce papers and walk away. She'll fight me." "Then don't give her the chance," Victoria said, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You deserve better, Richard. Someone who fits your lifestyle. Someone who doesn't embarrass you every time she walks into a room." Richard's gaze faltered. He hated admitting it, but Victoria was right. Catherine, with her simple charm and modest ways, was a stark contrast to the polished, sophisticated image he wanted to project. Over time, her warmth had begun to feel suffocating, her contentment with their life a mirror reflecting his own dissatisfaction. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though the weight of her implication was already sinking in. Victoria leaned closer, her eyes glinting with calculated intent. "Accidents happen all the time. You just need the right opportunity. Something clean, something no one will question. And then we can be together, no strings, no secrets." Richard recoiled slightly, a pang of guilt creeping into his chest. But the allure of freedom, the promise of a life unburdened by his wife's presence, was too strong. He nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Victoria smiled, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small envelope. Inside was a forged document, along with detailed instructions for their plan. She slid it across the table to Richard. "It's all there," she said. "Her regular routes, the times she goes for her morning walks. We can arrange for a simple car accident, nothing suspicious. And if anyone asks, you'll have an airtight alibi." Richard stared at the envelope, his mind a whirlwind of fear and anticipation. The life he envisioned with Victoria dangled just out of reach, and all it would take was one irreversible decision. "Think it over," Victoria said, her voice softening as she reached across the table to place a hand over his. "But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait." As Richard left the cafe, the envelope tucked into his pocket, he couldn't shake the knot of dread forming in his stomach. Catherine's face flashed in his mind, her kind smile, her unwavering faith in him. He shook his head, steeling himself. This was for the best, he told himself. She would be better off without him. That night, Richard lay awake in bed, the sound of Catherine's soft breathing filling the silence. She had fallen asleep waiting for him, her hand resting gently on the space where he should have been. For a fleeting moment, guilt threatened to consume him, but when he thought of Victoria and the life he could have, he buried the feeling deep. The next morning, Richard slipped out of the house before Catherine woke up, the forged document burning in his pocket like a silent promise. He had no idea that the choices he was making would set off a chain of events far beyond his control, and that karma had already begun to circle back, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Richard's heart raced as he sat in his car, parked at a discreet distance from the park where Catherine took her morning walks. The envelope Victoria had given him sat on the passenger seat, its contents now imprinted on his mind. The plan was simple, almost terrifyingly so. A carefully orchestrated accident that would leave no room for suspicion. As Catherine emerged from their home, dressed in her usual workout attire, Richard felt a pang of doubt. Her face held the serene expression he had grown so used to, the same face that had once brought him comfort. But now he was focused on the life he believed awaited him, a life of status, wealth, and Victoria. He picked up his phone, dialing the number Victoria had insisted he use for communication. The line connected after one ring. "She's leaving now," Richard said, his voice tight. "You know what to do." "Relax," Victoria purred on the other end. "Everything is under control. Just stick to your part of the plan." Richard hung up, tossing the phone onto the dashboard. He adjusted his rearview mirror to catch Catherine's figure receding into the distance, oblivious to the danger that loomed. Across the park, a man sat in a black sedan, engine idling. His instructions were clear. Wait until Catherine reached the intersection at the far end of the path, then make it look like a tragic oversight. Victoria had made sure he was well compensated, and he didn't ask questions. The minutes ticked by. Catherine walked at her usual pace, occasionally stopping to admire the blooms on the trees that lined the path. She seemed unaware of the sinister plot unfolding around her. Richard, still parked at a safe distance, couldn't shake his unease. His mind replayed moments from their life together, her laughter echoing through the house, the way she always had a warm meal waiting for him no matter how late he came home. For a moment he considered calling it off, but then his phone buzzed. "It's happening now," Victoria's text read. A cold sweat broke out on Richard's brow. He gripped the steering wheel, watching as Catherine approached the intersection. The black sedan rolled forward, its movements deliberate, yet unassuming. Richard's chest tightened. This was it. But just as the car reached the intersection, Catherine bent down to tie her shoe. The driver, caught off guard, swerved to avoid her, clipping a nearby lamppost instead. The sound of screeching tires and the crunch of metal filled the air. Richard's heart nearly stopped. He watched as Catherine straightened up, startled but unharmed. She looked toward the commotion, her expression one of concern, and hurried to the driver's side of the crashed vehicle. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine worry. The driver, dazed but unharmed, waved her off. "I'm fine," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. From his vantage point, Richard's hands trembled. The plan had failed. Worse, Catherine's selflessness had only underscored everything he had chosen to overlook about her. He drove away quickly, unable to bear the sight of her compassion, a compassion he had so cruelly betrayed. Later that day, Richard met with Victoria at her apartment, his face pale and his nerves frayed. "What happened?" she demanded, her tone sharp. The driver missed, Richard said, pacing the room. She wasn't even hurt. Victoria's face darkened. He had one job. She stopped to tie her shoe, Richard snapped, frustration leaking into his voice. What do we do now? Victoria crossed her arms, her mind already racing for a new plan. We regroup. This isn't over. She's just been lucky so far. But Richard wasn't so sure anymore. The sight of Catherine helping the driver, her kindness in the face of what could have been tragedy, had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. For the first time, he wondered if this path he had chosen, this plan to rid himself of the woman he once vowed to cherish, was a mistake he could never undo. Richard sat at his desk, his head buried in his hands. The failed attempt at the park had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. Victoria's voice echoed in his ears from their last meeting, her insistence that they couldn't stop now. But something within him had shifted. Catherine's concern for the driver, the genuine kindness in her actions, haunted him. That night, Richard returned home earlier than usual. Catherine was in the kitchen humming softly as she prepared dinner. The aroma of her homemade stew filled the air, a scent that had once made Richard feel at home. Hi, she said, looking up with a warm smile. You're early today. Long day. Richard nodded, his throat tightening. Yeah, just needed some peace. Catherine placed a bowl of stew in front of him and sat across the table. Well, I hope this helps. As Richard ate in silence, he noticed the little things he had taken for granted. Her attentive questions, her quiet laughter, the way she always made sure he had his favorite dish on the table. For a fleeting moment he wondered if he had been blind to the life they had built together, trading it all for a dream that felt increasingly hollow. Meanwhile, Victoria was growing restless. She hadn't heard from Richard all day, and her patience was wearing thin. Picking up her phone, she sent him a text. We need to meet. Call me. When Richard didn't respond, Victoria decided to take matters into her own hands. She arrived at Richard and Catherine's home unannounced, her heels clicking sharply against the driveway. Catherine opened the door, surprised to see the unfamiliar woman standing there. Can I help you? Catherine asked politely. Victoria forced a smile, her eyes scanning Catherine with a thinly veiled disdain. I'm an old friend of Richard's. Is he home? Catherine tilted her head, slightly confused. He didn't mention anyone visiting tonight. Please, come in. I'll let him know you're here. Victoria stepped inside, her gaze roaming the cozy interior. It wasn't what she had expected. Everything about Catherine's home felt warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold perfection she prided herself on. She stood in the living room, her irritation growing as she heard Catherine calling for Richard upstairs. Moments later, Richard appeared, his face a mask of shock and dread as he spotted Victoria. What are you doing here? He hissed, his voice low. We need to talk, Victoria said, her tone laced with impatience. Privately. Richard, is everything okay? Catherine asked, her brows furrowing in concern as she entered the room. Richard hesitated, his mind racing. Yeah, everything's fine. Catherine, could you give us a minute? Catherine nodded reluctantly and disappeared into the kitchen. Once they were alone, Victoria rounded on Richard. What's wrong with you? You're dragging your feet when we should be moving forward. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his frustration bubbling to the surface. It's not that simple, Victoria. She's not what I thought. Victoria narrowed her eyes. Don't tell me you're having second thoughts. I don't know, Richard admitted, his voice heavy. Maybe I am. She's done nothing but care for me. Seeing her with that driver, she's better than I deserve. Victoria's face twisted in anger. You're weak. Do you think she'll forgive you if she finds out what you've been planning? You'll lose everything. Maybe I should lose it, Richard muttered, more to himself than to Victoria. Maybe that's what I deserve. Unbeknownst to them, Catherine stood in the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding. She had intended to bring them tea, but Richard's words stopped her in her tracks. She didn't understand everything, but she caught enough to sense the betrayal lurking beneath the surface. Catherine quietly returned to the kitchen, her mind racing. What could Richard have meant? What had he been planning with this woman? Doubt and unease gnawed at her, but she resolved to keep her composure. If there was a secret, she would uncover it on her own terms. The tension between Richard and Victoria escalated as they continued their heated exchange, oblivious to Catherine's growing suspicions. As Victoria stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her, Richard sank into the couch, his head in his hands. For the first time, the weight of his choices felt unbearable. Upstairs, Catherine sat in the dark, her hands trembling as she pieced together fragments of their conversation. Whatever was happening, she knew one thing for certain. Her husband was not the man she thought he was. Catherine lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Richard's demeanor, his cryptic words, and Victoria's unsettling presence swirled in her mind. Doubts began to creep into her heart, doubts she had never allowed herself to entertain before. She had always believed in Richard, always stood by his side, but something had shifted. The next morning, Catherine resolved to find answers. While Richard left for work, she searched for clues in their home. She sifted through his desk drawers, scanned his email on their shared computer, and even checked his recent text messages on the tablet he often left behind. At first, everything seemed normal, until she found a hidden folder on his laptop labeled Projects. Inside the folder, Catherine discovered documents outlining financial transactions and property transfers. Most concerning were the emails between Richard and Victoria. Though the messages were cryptic, they hinted at something sinister. References to finalizing the plan, tying up loose ends, and freedom soon. Her heart raced as the reality of their betrayal sank in. Tears blurred her vision, but Catherine refused to succumb to despair. Instead, a fierce resolve took hold. If Richard and Victoria thought they could manipulate and discard her, they were wrong. She would protect herself, no matter what it took. Later that day, Catherine visited her best friend, Clara. They met at a quiet cafe downtown, where Catherine shared her discoveries in a hushed voice. "He's planning something," Catherine whispered, her hands trembling as she showed Clara the emails. "I don't know what, but it's not good." Clara leaned closer, her brow furrowed. "This is serious, Catherine. You need to confront him." Catherine shook her head. "Not yet. If I confront him now, he'll just lie. I need more proof." Clara nodded, her concern evident. "Then you need help. You can't do this alone." Meanwhile, Richard met with Victoria at a discreet location, a luxury apartment that Victoria often used to conduct her private affairs. She was fuming, pacing the room as Richard sat on the couch, looking exhausted. "We're running out of time," Victoria snapped. "You need to act now or everything we've worked for will fall apart." Richard sighed, his head in his hands. "I don't know if I can go through with it. She's done nothing wrong." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "She's an obstacle, Richard. You wanted out, and I gave you away. Don't get cold feet now." Richard looked away, guilt gnawing at him. He had dug himself into a hole so deep that he couldn't see a way out. Victoria, however, was relentless, her ambition blinding her to his hesitation. As the days passed, Catherine began her own plan. She hired a private investigator, a discreet and experienced woman named Elena, to uncover the truth about Richard and Victoria's scheme. Elena worked quickly, tailing Richard and gathering evidence. It didn't take long for her to uncover incriminating details: financial irregularities, secret meetings, and even a life insurance policy Richard had recently updated with Catherine as the primary beneficiary. Elena presented the findings to Catherine one evening at Clara's home. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and it painted a clear picture of Richard's intentions. "He's planning to stage an accident," Elena said grimly. "The policy payout is substantial, and there's a direct paper trail leading to Victoria." Catherine's hands clenched into fists. "He was going to kill me." Clara put a comforting hand on Catherine's shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We'll stop him." Catherine nodded, her eyes steely with determination. "No," she said firmly. "He's not going to get away with this. It's time for him to learn that I'm stronger than he ever imagined." As Catherine worked with Clara and Elena to formulate a plan, Richard grew increasingly paranoid. His guilt over Catherine and the pressure from Victoria weighed heavily on him, making him jumpy and irritable. Even Victoria began to notice his unraveling state. "You need to get it together," Victoria hissed during one of their clandestine meetings. "If you don't, everything will fall apart." Richard glared at her. "I didn't sign up for this. You pushed me into it." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Don't act like a victim, Richard. You wanted her gone just as much as I did." But deep down, Richard wasn't so sure anymore. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had built a life with, haunted his thoughts. He wondered if there was a way to undo the damage he had caused, but Victoria's grip on him felt suffocating. As Catherine prepared for the confrontation ahead, she found unexpected strength within herself. For too long, she had been the quiet, supportive wife, putting everyone else's needs before her own. But now, she realized it was time to fight for her life, her dignity, and her future. When Richard returned home that evening, Catherine greeted him with a calm smile. She had set the stage for what would come next, and she was ready to see it through. Richard entered their home that evening, tired and irritable. Catherine met him at the door, her expression unreadable. The house was unusually quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. "Hi," he muttered, shrugging off his coat and tossing it on the armchair. "How was your day?" Catherine's smile was faint, her tone calm. "Eventful." Richard looked at her curiously but dismissed it, heading toward the kitchen. "I'll grab a drink." As he reached for a glass, Catherine spoke from behind him, her voice steady and firm. "We need to talk, Richard." Her tone stopped him in his tracks. Turning around, he saw her standing at the edge of the counter, a folder in her hands. There was a quiet determination in her eyes that unsettled him. "About what?" he asked, forcing a casual tone. "About us," Catherine replied, sliding the folder across the counter toward him. "And about this." Richard's heart sank as he opened the folder. Inside were printouts of emails, bank statements, and pictures of him with Victoria. His face turned pale as he flipped through the damning evidence, each page revealing the depths of his betrayal. What is this?" he stammered, his voice shaking. "You know exactly what it is," Catherine said coldly. "It's everything I need to prove that you and Victoria plan to get rid of me." Richard's knees nearly buckled. "Catherine, Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "Don't insult me with lies. I trusted you, Richard. I stood by you through everything, and this is how you repay me? By plotting with your ex to kill me?" Richard's hands trembled as he placed the folder down. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he whispered. "It was a mistake." Catherine laughed bitterly. "A mistake? You forged documents, planned my accident, and thought you could walk away with everything. That's not a mistake, Richard. That's calculated cruelty." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Richard looked at Catherine, confused and nervous. "Who's that?" he asked. "Why don't you find out?" Catherine replied, crossing her arms. Richard hesitated but went to answer the door. Standing there were two police officers, accompanied by Elena, the private investigator. His stomach dropped. "Mr. Richard Harrington?" one of the officers asked. "Yes," Richard croaked. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud," the officer said, stepping inside. Richard's face went white as the officers handcuffed him. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. Catherine, tell them." Catherine stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression cold. "I already did. I told them everything." As Richard was led away, Victoria arrived, rushing toward the house with panic in her eyes. She had no time to react before officers approached her as well. "Victoria Langston, you're under arrest," one officer said. "What? This is absurd," Victoria shouted, struggling against them. "Richard, do something." But Richard was already being pushed into the back of a police car, his head hung low in defeat. Victoria screamed and cursed, but it was no use. The evidence Catherine and Elena had gathered was undeniable. Once the cars disappeared down the street, Catherine closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. Clara emerged from the living room, her expression a mix of relief and admiration. "You did it," Clara said, pulling Catherine into a hug. Catherine nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It's over." "No," Clara said softly. "It's just beginning. You're free now, Catherine. Free to rebuild your life on your terms." Catherine smiled through her tears, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The house felt emptier in the days following Richard's arrest. Though the silence was unsettling at first, it was a silence Catherine welcomed, a silence free from deceit and betrayal. She sat in the sunlit corner of her living room, poring over documents. They weren't legal papers this time, but plans for a new business venture she had dreamt of for years. Catherine had always wanted to open a wellness center, a space for women to heal and rediscover themselves. Now she had the clarity and determination to make it happen. Clara entered carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. "You've been at it all morning," she said, placing one mug beside Catherine. "Take a break." Catherine smiled gratefully and leaned back in her chair. "I feel like I can finally breathe again, Clara. For so long I let Richard's shadow dictate my life. Now, I'm finally stepping out of it." Clara beamed at her. "You've always been strong, Catherine. It just took a storm to show you how resilient you truly are." The first step of rebuilding was untangling the financial mess Richard had left behind. With Elena's help, Catherine uncovered hidden accounts and assets Richard had tried to keep from her. She used those funds to secure her wellness center's future. The irony wasn't lost on her. What Richard had intended as his safety net would now be the foundation of her independence. The second step was reclaiming her identity. Catherine joined local women's groups, sharing her story and listening to others. Through their stories of survival and resilience, she found camaraderie and strength. One afternoon, as Catherine was organizing files for her wellness center, her lawyer called. "Catherine," the lawyer said, "you'll be pleased to know that the court has frozen Richard's remaining assets. His trial date has been set." Catherine felt a mix of relief and finality. "Thank you," she said. "I'll be there." She hung up and looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. The storm in her life had passed, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. That evening, Catherine joined Clara for dinner at their favorite cafe. The cozy ambiance and comforting aroma of fresh bread were a welcome contrast to the chaos that had once consumed her life. "To new beginnings," Clara toasted, lifting her glass of sparkling water. Catherine clinked her glass against Clara's and smiled. "To rediscovering who we are, and never letting anyone take that away again." As they ate, Catherine's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from a local charity that helped survivors of abuse and betrayal. They had heard her story and wanted her to speak at their upcoming event. Catherine felt a lump in her throat as she read the email. She had spent so long thinking she was just a victim, but now she realized she had a voice and a story that could inspire others. Later that night, Catherine stood in her bedroom gazing at her reflection. She no longer saw the woman who had doubted her worth, or the wife who had endured Richard's coldness. She saw someone who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. Catherine ran her fingers over a necklace her mother had given her, a simple pendant inscribed with the words, "Courage to begin again." She smiled softly, knowing that she was finally living those words. The days ahead were uncertain, but Catherine no longer feared uncertainty. She embraced it, knowing that the life she was building now was one of her choosing. It wasn't about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It was about becoming the woman she was always meant to be. The courtroom was packed on the day of Richard's sentencing. The air buzzed with a mix of tension and anticipation as spectators, journalists, and legal professionals gathered to witness the conclusion of a scandal that had shocked the community. Catherine sat in the front row, her posture calm yet resolute. Clara sat beside her, offering silent support, while Elena represented her as legal counsel. Richard, once so proud and untouchable, now sat in the defendant's seat, his tailored suit doing little to mask the worn, haggard look on his face. The judge entered, and the court fell silent. The charges were read aloud: fraud, conspiracy, and attempted harm. The weight of his actions echoed through the room as each accusation was listed. Catherine listened with a quiet determination, no longer shaken by the sound of his name or his actions. She had found her strength. As the prosecution presented its case, the evidence was damning. Emails, financial records, and testimonies painted a vivid picture of Richard's betrayal, not just of Catherine, but of the ethics and integrity he once claimed to uphold. When it was Catherine's turn to testify, she rose with grace and approached the stand. The room was silent as she began to speak. "For years I stood in the shadows of a man I trusted, believing that my worth was tied to his success and approval," she began, her voice steady. "But betrayal has a way of unveiling truths. It strips away illusions and leaves you with a choice to crumble or to rise. I chose to rise." She turned to Richard, meeting his gaze for the first time in months. "You may have underestimated me, Richard, but I will never underestimate myself again. Your actions do not define me. They define you." The courtroom remained silent as she returned to her seat, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Even Richard seemed unable to maintain his usual smugness, his gaze dropping to the floor. The defense tried to mitigate the damage, but the evidence and Catherine's testimony were too compelling. When the judge delivered the verdict, sentencing Richard to years in prison and ordering restitution to Catherine, a sense of finality washed over the room. Catherine exhaled deeply, a weight lifting from her shoulders. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for her attention. Catherine paused for a moment, addressing the crowd. "This isn't just about one man's betrayal. she said, her voice clear and confident. It's about resilience, justice, and the power of truth. For anyone who feels lost or powerless, know that you are stronger than you realize. This is not the end of my story, it's the beginning of something greater. She walked away from the cameras, the sun warm on her face, feeling freer than she ever had before. In the following months, Catherine's life blossomed in ways she hadn't imagined. Her wellness center opened to great success, offering a haven for women seeking support and empowerment. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing her journey and inspiring others to reclaim their lives. Catherine found joy in the simple things: morning walks with Clara, evenings spent journaling, and the sense of purpose that came with helping others. She no longer felt the need to define herself through someone else's lens. She was enough, just as she was. One evening, as Catherine was locking up her wellness center, Clara appeared with a bottle of champagne. "What's the occasion?" Catherine asked with a laugh. Clara grinned. "You, my dear, for surviving, thriving, and proving that karma always has the last word." They toasted under the stars, their laughter carrying into the night. Catherine's heart swelled with gratitude, not just for her newfound freedom, but for the strength and resilience that had brought her here. As she gazed at the night sky, she whispered to herself, "This is my story now, and it's just beginning." And so, Catherine's journey came full circle, a testament to the power of perseverance, justice, and self-love. Though life had tested her, she emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the future with open arms. Karma had struck back, not just to deliver justice, but to pave the way for a brighter tomorrow. Was this tale of betrayal and karma as gripping for you as it was for us? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and justice. Stay tuned. Your next emotional roller coaster is just a click away.